Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Rear Admiral Ted Walker, the President of the Navy Memorial, and I want to welcome you to this Richard Nixon Legacy Forum, specifically addressing the Cold War strategy and his effect upon it. It's my pleasure to have you here with us today. This Navy Memorial has been here for now 22 years. We are in existence to honor the service of people who have served in all the sea services, Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and our National Merchant Marine. And as you can see behind me here, President Nixon was in fact in the Navy. He served in the Second World War. He served in a job that was close to my heart as a supply officer. He was a freight cargo forwarder. And I think he was probably most famous for helping the troops out because somehow or other he got a channel to get hold of fresh hamburger meat once or twice a month, and he had Nick's Hamburger stand on one of those islands, steamy islands in the South Pacific. Like so many, he labored under extremely difficult conditions, unsung, but absolutely critical to our winning the war. So it's my pleasure to host this and to have this forum here on Pennsylvania Avenue on America's Main Street. And with that, I would like to turn you over to the coordinator of the Richard Nixon Legacy Program, Mr. Jeff Shepard.
Good morning and welcome. I'm here to open the 11th of our series of Richard Nixon Legacy Forums. This is the first one on foreign affairs. Part of the reason is because I spent 5 years on President Nixon's staff doing domestic affairs. And I feel far more comfortable in that area, but we decided we ought to recognize that he was really a foreign affairs expert too. So this is, and we're really pleased to do this. We're starting with Richard Nixon as Cold War strategist. If you would study the Cold War, an excellent way to start is to study the public life of Richard Nixon. As a congressman, a senator, vice president, years as a private citizen and then as president, and years as an elder statesman, the Cold War was an everyday focus. And for America, we were extraordinarily fortunate to have such a well-prepared, thoroughly experienced individual involved in that area. And we know that because of the records. And one of the interesting things that we're able to have welcome us today is the Archivist of the United States, who is the keeper of those records. David Ferrero is a super archivist. He's a librarian. He was librarian at Duke and at MIT, and then he was head of the New York Public Libraries before he became the National Archivist. I like this story because at one point in the recent past, I had a meeting with him, and I snuck in 5 or 6 books, because I know he's a lover of books, that represented a different point of view on some aspect of the Nixon presidency. And I put the books on a table, and we had our meeting, and I made the point. He got the point without the books. But then it occurred to me it was going to be a whole lot easier having gotten the books in to the National Archives than to get the books back out. And fortunately, David sent an assistant down so that I was able to take books out of the National Archives. I think I'm one of the very few people who's ever been able to do that. But with that introduction, let me introduce David Ferrero, Archivist of the United States.
Thank you, Jeff. It's a special treat to be here in this building as a Navy vet. It's very nice to have my office right across the street, and I wander over here as often as I can, so it's very appropriate that we're meeting here. It's also a great pleasure to join you this morning for the latest in the distinguished series of Nixon Legacy Forums, co-sponsored by the Nixon Foundation and the National Archives. The National Archives assumed responsibility for presidential libraries in 1941 when we accepted the Roosevelt Library from FDR's family and foundation. In 2007, the Nixon Library joined us as the 12th of what are now 13 presidential libraries. A couple of months ago in February, We moved more than 42 million pages of Nixon presidential records from our facility in College Park, Maryland, to the major new archival facility we built at the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda, California. Now the entire Nixon story, from his early years to his almost 2 decades of post-presidential contributions, are in one place and under one roof. The Nixon Library arguably holds the fullest record of any presidential administration in history. And we know that many major works of scholarship will now begin to emerge from that rich trove assembled so carefully in Yorba Linda. As these legacy forums of Nixon administration alumni illustrate and illuminate our 37th president's domestic policies, and today, for the first time, his foreign policy, they'll play a vital part in filling in a blank that papers and even tapes can't do. They will convey a real sense of what it was like to be there. Now it's my pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's Nixon Legacy Forum, Edward F. Cox. He has served 3 presidents and 4 governors of his home state of New York. He's been particularly active in the areas of judicial excellence, education policy, and the environment. In 2009, he was elected chairman of the New York State Republican Party. Of course, he was the 37th president's son-in-law, married Tricia Nixon in the Rose Garden at the White House in June 1971. And during the post-presidential years, he accompanied Mr. Nixon on many foreign trips, including some to China, the Far East, and the Soviet Union and Russia. Ladies and gentlemen, Ed Cox.
David, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here for this forum. I think I'd like to lead off by setting the stage about the values that President Nixon held dear and that was really a part of his makeup, that in fact those values that were at the basis of everything that he did. And to do that, I'm going to read from Senator Dole's eulogy in 1994 for President Nixon. Senator Dole said, "I believe that the second half of the 20th century will be known as the age of Nixon. Why was he the most durable figure of our time? Because he always embodied the deepest feelings of the people he led. One of his biographies said that Richard Nixon was one of us." For those among you who are wondering who that was Tom Wicker, no great Nixon fan. But he said Richard Nixon was one of us. And so he was, says Senator Dole. To tens of millions of his countrymen, Richard Nixon was an American hero who shared and honored their belief in working hard, worshiping God, loving their families, and saluting the flag. He called them the silent majority. Like them, they valued accomplishment more than ideology. They wanted their government to do the decent thing, but not to bankrupt the nation. They wanted its protection in a dangerous world, but they also wanted creative statesmanship in achieving a genuine peace with honor. It is true that no one knew the world better than Richard Nixon. As a result, the man who was born in a house that his father built would go on to become this century's greatest architect of peace. Richard Nixon, who I knew intimately for 30 years, was a genuinely great man. Some men are great because of the positions they hold, and they do well in those positions. Richard Nixon was just a great man, period. And that's because some of the basic attributes that he had. And of those attributes, I would say the most important was his tremendous intellect, an intellect that thought strategically. His daughter, Tricia, said if there was any one characteristic about him that was most important, it was that he thought strategically. I wouldn't call him an intellectual. If I did, lightning would probably strike me, because an intellectual on his or her own was not what Richard Nixon was about. He was about putting actions together with thought. And anyone who has worked with him, as these men have, they understood how he put thought together with action. Let me read to you from his writings in which he talked about the interaction between intellectual thought and action. He said, reading is also indispensable to providing perspective. So when you tackle a specific problem, you will think broadly and not narrowly, deeply, not superficially. Most of the great leaders I have met, and he names them: Churchill, de Gaulle, de Gasperi, Menzies, Yoshida, Mao Zedong, Zhou Enlai, were prolific readers. Each of these men was a far-sighted strategic thinker, not because he inherited that trait, but as a result of his habits of reading and contemplation. And he concludes this chapter on thinking in one of his post-presidential books by saying, "There's no greater exhilaration than the sense of accomplishment you feel after making a decision based on careful, intense thought. In the end, thinking provides the inner peace and serenity necessary for decisive and effective action." A man of thought and a man of action, that was Richard Nixon. Among his other attributes that served him well was his acute sense of shifting political forces, both domestically, which made him the effective politician that he was, and also internationally, which made him into the architect, the great architect of peace that he was. And in his post-presidential years after he finished his memoirs, he came back to New York. And he wrote a book during the 1980 campaign, a book that Lynn Nofziger, who was an advisor to then candidate Reagan, made sure was placed on the table next to Reagan when pictures were taken of him for the cover of Time magazine. So this was the Reagan campaign saying, Richard Nixon's thinking in foreign affairs is our thinking. The book was entitled The Real War, and this was a time when the Soviets were on the move. We were still recovering from Vietnam. You had the neocons growing, you had the Committee on Present Danger. And in this context, President Nixon wrote, and this is the essence of what he was saying about foreign policy at the time: "The United States represents hope, freedom, security, and peace. The Soviet Union stands for fear, tyranny, aggression, and war. If we are determined to win, if we resolve to accept no substitute for victory, then victory becomes possible. Then the spirit gives edge to the sword, and the sword preserves the spirit, and freedom will prevail." Those are stirring words, fighting words, words that were attempting to bring back the fighting spirit, as Reagan was trying to do in the 80 campaign and in his early presidency, to confront the Soviet Union that in the post-Vietnam era was on the move across the world. In 1982, I was privileged to travel with President Nixon to Eastern Europe. We went to Czechoslovakia, to Hungary, to Romania, to Bulgaria. They didn't let him into Poland. If he had gone into Poland, I think they were afraid he was so popular there, it would have caused a serious riot that could have toppled the regime. But on that trip, he had some very intense discussions with people like President Kadar of Hungary. And as was typical as he did on his travels, he absorbed what was going on. He absorbed not just in Eastern Europe, but Eastern Europe, which was so closely reacting to what was going on in the Soviet Union. And he came back and quickly wrote a book, not about real war, but about real peace was the title of it. Small book, small volume, no index. He just wanted to get it out. 5,000 copies, distributed to thought leaders and the political leaders around the country, because he knew it was time for a change. And here's what he said. This is Richard Nixon reacting to realities on the stage and trying to change the approach of the country, of the administration. He said, "The costs of Soviet conquests are a massive drain on its desperately weak economy. The British may have been enriched by their empire, but the Soviets are being impoverished by theirs." And talking about Andropov, who was the Soviet leader at the time, "The assets are his military power. Great as they are, his assets are ill-suited to solving his problems. He has to look for ways to deal with his problems, or at least to mitigate them. That fact brings the prospect for real peace. Great. Putting it simply, both sides want peace. The United States because we believe in peace, the Soviets because they need it. The time is ripe for a deal. This was hard-headed détente, as he called it. 1983, time to adjust, time to make a deal, time to negotiate. I think we have here some sound bites that have never been heard before. Richard Nixon in 1983 talking about détente.
Called talking to Manuel Brosio, the former Secretary General of NATO, a great Italian diplomat who served 6 years in Moscow before he came to the United States. And he told me in the late 60s, before I became president, very, very vigorously when many Europeans were clamoring for détente, he said, I know the Russians. They are liars. They are great actors. They are cheaters. And they lie and they act because they consider it's their duty to do so. He says, you cannot trust them. Now, having said that, however, he did not go on to say that you should not deal with them. And my answer to this whole proposal or question as to whether or not the Russians can be trusted is very simply only if we make agreements which are in their interest to keep, self-enforcing agreements, and only if everything we do with them positively is linked to something else which will cost them if they break the agreement. But you can't trust them on the basis that, well, we're sincere and they're sincere. That is totally irrelevant where the Russians are concerned. Reason is that their goal is very different from ours. To simplify it, our goal is peace, is an end in itself, and their goal is victory. And whether it's peace or war, it's a means to the end of victory, the Soviet or Russian or communist domination of the world. And under Marxist-Leninist teachings, you use any means to achieve that great goal. And if it requires that you lie and you cheat, you lie and you cheat. Now, under the circumstances, we simply do not follow that particular type of, quote, morality, unquote. And under the circumstances, however, in dealing with them, it doesn't mean that we have to lie and cheat, but we must be aware of the fact that they will when they can get away with it. But on the other hand, you can deal with them and they will keep a deal if you make it on the basis that will serve their interests and ours. I do not think that morality is really relevant as far as they're concerned. They are thinking in terms of the total communist world, a communist society for everybody, equality and everything else that communism in its ideal state is supposed to produce. And they believe, therefore, that anything they do to achieve that is therefore justifiable. I recall, for example, a conversation with regard to the whole idea of whether or not they were sincere that I had with Ambassador Bolin, our former ambassador to Russia, and a great Russian expert. And he was concerned, this was in the early 60s, after he had become ambassador to Paris, by statements out of Washington in the early 60s, that some Washington people in the government were convinced that Khrushchev was sincere in his desire for peace. And he said, that is so stupid, and it is so wrong. He said, he is a communist. He can no more be sincere than this table, there was a coffee table between us, can be sincere. He is a materialist. And he will therefore be for whatever is necessary to achieve his ends. Sincerity has nothing to do with it.
You see here a man who understands that you need to do a deal, to negotiate, but you got to negotiate from strength and knowing who you're negotiating with. But it's time to negotiate because of those years, those early years of the Reagan presidency, the United States had come back in its military strength and its fighting spirit. The Soviet had declined because of its economic problems. The time was ripe to do a deal. This is his sense of the shifting political forces and what we ought to do with them. You also saw here a second point I want to raise, his ability to communicate in clear, simple phrases. Those of our panel who watched him work on his speeches, he would work them over and over again on his yellow pad. Not just the words, but his thoughts, honing them down so that every word had meaning. And his audience understood that and was complimented by it, and that's what made him such an effective communicator. The other point I'd like to raise about him, a basic attribute that he had throughout his political career, is evidence throughout his career. He rejected political correctness, the accepted wisdom, the veneer that people would have, and was put forward. He would try and get to the essence of what the situation was or the person was. Alger Hiss and Whittaker Chambers, very good example at the start. He saw through Alger Hiss and stood with Whittaker Chambers, even though Chambers was disheveled, disorganized, and Hiss was a member of the elite, and it was very well put together. He said, no, Chambers is right, Hiss is wrong, and he was right about that. You could take the next step, you talk at the end of his career about Gorbachev and Yeltsin. Everyone was impressed with Gorbachev. Here's a man we can deal with. But he went with Yeltsin because he understood the essence of Gorbachev. Gorbachev wanted to just improve communism. Yeltsin was a true Democrat, lower D, who wanted to turn Russia into a true democracy, and he was the person we should work with despite all of his personal problems, the drinking and all the other things we know about Yeltsin. I had an experience. I happened to be down in Cuba and ended up in 1987 in a 4-hour conversation with Fidel Castro. And it was a simultaneous translation from midnight till 4 a.m. And in the middle of it, Castro blurted out, "How did Mr. Nixon know I was a communist?" 1959, in Washington, Castro just comes into power, comes to Washington, and he meets with the vice president. The vice president and he have a conversation, and the vice president then produced a memorandum to the president saying, this man's a communist, we got to do something about him. Of course, Castro was parading then as a great Democrat, and the liberal media and others were saying eventually that we had turned Castro into being a communist by our approach to him. Castro was saying to me in that comment that he was a communist. He was trying to deceive people about that. And President Nixon, Vice President Nixon saw through him, and that bugged him. It bothered him. He wanted to know, how did he do that? Well, that was the ability of Mr. Nixon to see through to the essence of what a person was or a situation. Finally, I'd like to emphasize the courage that he had of his convictions. Some people have those great insights, but aren't willing to go out there on the political stage and say and fight for them. Whether it was Hiss, or whether it was that memo with respect to Castro, or whether in his final years talking about Yeltsin and pushing with the Bush administration in private and public forums. Yeltsin's the man we have to deal with. He had the courage of his convictions, which came through in everything that he did. Briefly, I'd like to say a few things about him personally and the settings in which he worked. Since he liked to think, ideas were more important to him than things. He lived simply. Small, simple bedroom and study. His favorite room in the White House was the Lincoln sitting room. He had his hideaway office next to the Oval Office, his EOB hideaway. He often entertained in his post-presidential years in New York City in our small library in our apartment, with Tricia being the hostess for heads of state, heads of government, and others who would come to visit him there. Never went on a board, never accepted an honorarium. He gave up his Secret Service because they were an impediment to his moving around freely, and he didn't feel that the government should pay for it. For a living, he wrote books, but he wrote books like the one I showed you, Real Peace. Didn't make any money off it. He wanted to get his message across. And he made speeches for impact, not for the money that was involved. And as a result, he did have impact. Of course, his biggest one was his trip to China. Just briefly, of course, my interests back in the 60s were very singular. One word, Tricia. That was it. But in the process, I interacted with Mr. Nixon as he was campaigning. for the presidency, and I happened to be in the library on apartment on Fifth Avenue in February of 1968. And the discussion then in the newspapers were Nixon's secret plan for peace. What was it? Of course, he never talked about that. That was Rockefeller pushing Nixon to say something, to expose what his plan was. Rockefeller didn't think Nixon had a plan. I happened to be in the library waiting for Tricia to change her clothes. We were going out. And he comes in after a hard day of campaigning. He's relaxing. He liked to listen to Tchaikovsky. And should I ask him or not? Well, I'm almost a member of the family. Mr. Nixon, what's your plan? I'm going to go to Peking. I'm going to go to Moscow. And that's how we're going to bring about peace in Vietnam and in the world. Wow. I didn't tell anyone. Just kept it to myself. He had already thought out what he was going to do. He had built up the intellectual capital that served his presidency so well in the foreign policy area. Of course, there are many other areas that will be discussed here. The Yom Kippur War and how he settled that led to Camp David and the Oslo Accords, or peace with honor in Vietnam, ending the draft that led to the volunteer army, and a lot of the way we fight now in many ways. The India-Pakistan War, which still defines in many ways what's going on in the subcontinent now. Even at the end of his career, end of his life, in 1994, he was still in the game. He was still thinking strategically. And to him, the Cold War, the effects of the Cold War still were not over. And he was concerned about Russia. And his basic thesis was communism is dead in Russia, but democracy has not yet won. And for that reason, he was traveling back and forth to Russia, worried about whether it was Gorbachev or Yeltsin, speaking out on that topic. I remember he came back on a trip several months before he died. I was in his library, gets a call from President Clinton. They had a conversation about Clinton's Russian policy. And you could see in the subsequent months, Clinton's Russian policy changed, along with the advice that was given by Richard Nixon. So that's, as I see it, the essence of the man. I'd like to conclude by going back to Senator Dole's eulogy. And he talks about the last time he saw President Nixon at a luncheon held in the Capitol honoring the 25th anniversary of his first inaugural. Without a note, President Nixon stood and delivered a compelling speech, capturing the global scene as only he could and sharing his vision of America's future. When it was over, he is surrounded by Democrats and Republicans alike, each wanting just one more word of Nixonian counsel, one more insight into world affairs. And Dole concluded, "May the day of judging President Nixon on anything less than his entire life and career, may that come to a close." And that's what this forum is about, and the distinguished folk here who served in President Nixon's administration to address President Nixon and the Cold War. And let me introduce them. Our first speaker will be Richard Allen. Mr. Allen headed the Foreign Affairs issue team during President Nixon's 1968 campaign and served as a senior member of President Nixon's National Security Council. He went on to serve as assistant to the President for National Security Affairs in the Reagan administration, and he is now a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and president of the Richard V. Allen Company, a Washington-based consulting services firm. Our next speaker is going to be Richard Solomon. Ambassador Solomon is president of the United States Institute of Peace. He served on the staff of the National Security Council from 1971 to 1976. In that position as an aide to National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, he supported President Nixon's efforts to normalize relations with the People's Republic of China. He also served in a variety of posts at the U.S. Department of State, including Director of Policy Planning, Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, and Ambassador to the Philippines. Our third speaker on this panel will be John Lehman. Secretary Lehman is chairman of J.F. Lehman & Company, a private equity investment firm. He has served as Secretary of the Navy during the Reagan administration, as a staff member to Henry Kissinger on the National Security Council, as a delegate to the force reductions negotiations in Vienna, and as Deputy Director of the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency. Richard Allen, you're up.
Thank you very much, Ed, and distinguished colleagues. Mr. Ferrero, nice to see you here. Jeff Shepard. Frank Gannon is lingering someplace up in the back. I did a mental calculation, and you are confronted, the audience is confronted today with about 210 years of a solid, hands-on Nixon experience. Also see our colleague Bud Crow here today, and add another many years of experience too, so pushing 225 or 30 years, which is a lot of time. And Ed, of course, Ed Cox, had the opportunity to see it from the inside, to travel with the president, especially after his presidency, got to know him very well. My personal acquaintance, and I think it's important to make these kinds of confessions, was having the opportunity to pass out Nixon, Eisenhower pamphlets in working class South Bend, Indiana, while I was imprisoned in a Catholic university there known as the University of Notre Dame. When I was all of 20 years old, I got to meet Mr. Nixon when he came to the Notre Dame campus, was enormously impressed. In 1957, I met him again while I was in Washington because I crashed a cocktail party at the Capitol Hilton when I was working here that summer. Walked into a room, saw a lady I knew I had seen before but couldn't identify, and the man next to her turned around and stuck out his hand. It was the Vice President of the United States. And I said, I met you last year at Notre Dame. I remember, he said, I remember. I began sending him my articles when I began to write. I went abroad to the University of Munich in Germany to do my postgraduate work for 3 years. Came back, began communicating with Mr. Nixon. He eventually moved to New York, and on a number of occasions I had the opportunity to visit him in New York, always wondering whether this man, who had the singular vision about the way the world ought to be organized, would in fact decide to run for president again after having the experience of 1960 and then the setback in 1962, having lost the governorship to Pat Brown in California, and making a declaration that some people thought meant that he would never again surface as a public figure. In 1966, he visited 47 congressional districts, and lo and behold, 47 Republican congressmen were elected, 46 men and 1 woman. And his thinking was moving more and more toward running for president again. By 1968, I was asked to take leave of absence from the Hoover Institution on War, Revolution, and Peace at Stanford University, and to come east to join a very young crowd. Pat Buchanan, 28 years old, Raymond Price, 30 years old. I was a little over 30 years old, 31 years old. Bill Sapphire, who wasn't but a few years older than we were. Alan Greenspan, and a very interesting cast of characters, young, and a very small campaign staff began to build. Martin Anderson, my colleague, my domestic counterpart, Richard Whalen, a great speechwriter and thinker. This little coterie of individuals put together, if you will, at Mr. Nixon's behest, comprehensive programs. What Ed said is very important, and it's also important when you study President Reagan, to whom I was quite close over a number of years as well, prior to the presidency and then during the presidency. You have to understand that the man read and understood. And when Ed said that President Nixon read, he did read deeply, and he communed deeply with those who had specialized knowledge. But he also wrote, and he wrote on tablets like that. And that's exactly the way he wrote his inauguration speech out at Gurney's Point in Long Island, when his first inaugural address. All of these study habits and these deep reading habits and these deep discussion habits and thinking habits are brought to bear in a way that we can't attribute to a lot of presidents that we've known, at least during my lifetime. That's not to say that the presidents weren't good or excellent or sometimes even great in their own right. But those that were the most serious and the most studious that I can recall in my own mind during this period of my lifetime, which spans from 1936 forward, thinkers and doers, based on deep thought, were two, Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan. I think Mr. Nixon's formation came about very naturally in a way. In 1946, he was drafted to run for Congress and was elected. In 1948, he began the investigation of Alger Hiss, who evoked the sympathies, if you will, of the entire establishment press. But as Ed correctly remarked, in the long run, Richard Nixon was right and Alger Hiss was wrong. Whittaker Chambers was right, disheveled as he was. I met Mr. Chambers once. He was right and Hiss was wrong, and history has proven that Hiss was a communist spy, a Soviet spy. He betrayed our secrets. Forged in that and the kind of reaction that came from it, he then moved on to a race against Helga Hagen Douglas in 1950. That also evoked the great antipathy. You could see, if you look back historically now, if you will, an anti-Nixon press forming. By 1968, it was a different story. And the good thinkers, and we had an awful lot of them in this very small campaign team, believed that it was time to demonstrate a new Nixon. And the new Nixon was very much part of the shtick, as they would say in these days. He even went in 1968 on Laugh-In, and his one line on Laugh-In was "Sock it to me." It was the crow's eyes and the smile, and, if you will, a new impression was created. A hard-fought campaign with Nelson Rockefeller, and I might add Henry Kissinger on the other side, who didn't even know Richard Nixon during 1968. A minor adjustment that Henry and I were able to make on the Vietnam platform so we'd have no argument. Nixon sails out in front. I happened to be reviewing the other night the only set of notes. I'm an inveterate and a note taker, I'm afraid. Page after page after page of the first cabinet meeting, the day after the cabinet was announced in a theater in the round approach, all of them together. Oddly enough, on that day, Mr. Nixon forgot the name of his best friend, his new Secretary of Commerce, Maurice Stans, for those of you who remember that day. It was kind of humorous. We had a day-long briefing, and my notes go on and on and on, and RN charged his cabinet with getting the right people in government. It was a stupendous lesson on how to staff a government. Take the people that you trust, and those that you don't know, those in the bureaucracy, try to convince them of the worth of your program, but always take the people that you trust. That lesson was not always learned, and as a consequence, we had some anomalies, shall I say, in administrations. Mr. Nixon's worldview was well developed. And I think he did think in terms of winning the Cold War, without question, winning the Cold War. That policy came off track for a brief period of time during the 1970s, when taking a simple term that is used in diplomacy to describe relaxation of tensions, détente, relaxation of tensions among nations or between nations, taking that one simple term and somehow elevating it into a form of theology, if you will, led to all sorts of offshoots of thinking in the government about the inevitability of the process. My good friend Zbigniew Brzezinski, who eventually became Jimmy Carter's national security advisor and a great thinker, even wrote a book entitled Convergence, which was describing basically how we would drift steadily leftward and the Soviet Union would drift steadily rightward, and at some point in the future we would converge. There was a lot of vulgar theory going on, and while I don't think Mr. Nixon shared it, tactically the use of what became the theology of détente eventually caused a great deal of ripples within the Republican Party and perhaps elsewhere as well, because it held the theory that if you could coax the Soviet Union into becoming dependent on trade and aid, the transfer of technology, you could alter its behavior by the threat of denial of that very same technology and trade to which it had become accustomed. It didn't work. It simply didn't work. And that caused, I believe, a bit of a setback. In the later years, after Mr. Nixon left office, I had the opportunity to visit him in California and have long discussions with him. And I think that he saw, too, that this had been elevated to a level that didn't make sense. But he did think constantly about people, and he was concerned about his country in a profound way. Finally, I want to mention the opening to China. Ed Cox heard it in February of '68. I heard it not long before that when I visited him in the law offices in New York City. I had made some inputs on an article for Foreign Affairs magazine in October of 1967. It was entitled Asia After Vietnam. And in that article, which was ignored by and large by the press, was a key paragraph or key set of sentences that indicated what RN really had in mind. He wasn't prepared to talk about what that plan was in any elaborate detail, lest the conversation get off track. What he wanted to do was plant the seed. I was not yet full-time in the campaign. I was at Hoover, and my job there was to be editor of the yearbook on international communist affairs. And as such, I had 16 or 17 people on the staff, and I had to go abroad to talk to people who were working for us in various places in Asia. And I was on the way to Korea, to Japan, and to Hong Kong. And Mr. Nixon said, "I'd like to give you letters for the president of Korea and for the prime minister of Japan, but I don't think the prime minister of Japan will see you." However, his brother, who was once prime minister as well, is a very good friend and was prime minister when I was vice president. So I went off with letters to former Premier Kishi in Japan and to President Park Chung-hee in Korea. And I was authorized by Mr. Nixon to drop that notion, and also another notion, the return of Okinawa, the prospective possible return of Okinawa would be considered were Richard Nixon to be elected. These two gifts, if you will, advance notice of what might happen with respect to China, although I couldn't be quite explicit, were very, very welcome in Japan. By the time I got to Korea, I couldn't deliver the letter because 4 days prior, the North Korean sapper squad, guerrillas, had attacked the Blue House, and the last of the crowd that had come over the DMZ was shot dead on the steps of the Blue House, the equivalent of the White House. So I couldn't effectively deliver the letter. As it was, Mr. Nixon had a broad vision for Asia after Vietnam, which meant that he saw a conclusion to Vietnam, which he wasn't permitted to conclude as promptly as he would have liked, peace with honor, but he saw something very profound. He opened the door to China. There's no question about it. No one else could have done it. But I do think that were he alive today, Richard Nixon would be having some very serious second thoughts about where that relationship has led and some of the overhanging dangers inherent in it.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Solomon.
My colleagues have touched on a number of the key points that I'd wanted to make, but I will put them in a broader framework.
Please do.
As we look at Richard Nixon's great contributions to our national security and our strategic positioning, it's very clear that the opening to China and the subsequent arms control negotiations with the Soviet Union, but particularly the China opening, fractured the dynamic of the Cold War. It restructured our dealings with the two major communist powers. And there's a long history to that kind of maneuvering, but the Nixon initiative really stands out. You can go back to George Washington's time. Here was our first president, even before the revolution, trying to figure out how to maneuver his would-be country between the French and the French and the British. The Russians were there, the Spanish were there. So if you look at the history of that early period, you see again the country trying to figure out how to deal with threats, pressures, and opportunities with countries abroad. But the China opening clearly stands out as one of the great strategic initiatives in 20th century diplomacy. Now, we can look at it in some very interesting perspectives that will reinforce what my colleagues have said. Richard Nixon, without question, came to the presidency as probably the best prepared candidate to deal with the world of the 20th century. And as we look back on his experiences as President Eisenhower's vice president, it's very clear that the kind of world he was confronting in the late 60s, he had dealt with in very similar structural terms in the 1950s. President Eisenhower dispatched Vice President Nixon to Asia in 1953. President Eisenhower was dealing with a very unpopular war in Korea. He was dealing with a recently formed Sino-Soviet alliance, an alliance between the Chinese and the Russians. And one of his problems was to reassure a range of allied countries in Asia that we would stand by them, that we would contribute to their security. So Vice President Nixon dealt with a world that 15, 16 years later, he confronts again. But this time, the challenge is not the Korean War, but it's the Vietnam War. This time, the Sino-Soviet relationship is showing at least signs of political strain. And again, we have Asian allied countries concerned about whether the United States will hang in there, will support their security. And in 1967, as Dick Allen has mentioned, Mr. Nixon, then in business, but also considering a run for the presidency, has to say to himself, if I win, the last thing I want to deal with is the burden of the Vietnam War. It was destroying the presidency of Lyndon Johnson. He knew it would be a great burden to his likely candidate challenger, one of them at that point, Hubert Humphrey. And the brilliance of his consideration of the world at that time was that he could see that there might be a possibility of splitting the communist world and creating circumstances where, as we like to refer to, he could leapfrog out of the Vietnam quagmire and reposition the United States as the most maneuverable and secure element in a strategic triangle, as we came to refer to it. What's very interesting about the 1967 article that Dick Allen has referred to, Asia After Vietnam, is its very title. He was again thinking beyond the quagmire, how do I get out of Vietnam into a new strategic environment? But the other thing that's very interesting as we reread that article today, there's somebody who's not mentioned in that article. There's a dog that isn't barking. There's almost no mention of the Soviet Union. That whatever thinking was going on that Ed Cox may have picked up was not communicated in anything but the most elliptical fashion, where Mr. Nixon had talked about the need to engage China so that it wouldn't persist in its posture of angry isolation. Well, the 16.7 article really didn't gain much attention, and what is fascinating about the subsequent history is the thing that gained world attention was a ping pong ball. And President Nixon, within 2 weeks of his inauguration in early 1969, had Henry Kissinger in and said that he wanted to try to engage the Chinese. And he started sending messages to Beijing, Peking, first through the Romanians and then the Pakistanis. And initially those messages didn't elicit much of a response. But in the summer of 1969, the Sino-Soviet feud, which up to that point had been largely political, erupted into serious military clashes along the Sino-Soviet border on the Ussuri River. And that signaled that the differences between the two major communist countries had reached a point where maybe something serious could be done. And shortly thereafter, Mr. Nixon began to see positive responses coming out of China. In October of 1970, Chairman Mao Zedong brought Edgar Snow atop Tiananmen for the National Day celebration, subtly signaling that he was prepared to talk to an American. And then, to everybody's shock, in April of '71, as Chairman Mao later said to, I guess it was to Henry Kissinger, or maybe it was the president himself, he said, all we did was we threw out a little ping pong ball and the world went crazy. That suddenly, in the United States in particular, the great fear that we would be drawn into a war with China over Vietnam, sort of reprising the fear that we had had in the Korean War of being drawn into a war with China. Suddenly, that ping pong diplomacy, the initiation of it, gave people a sense that maybe the game would significantly change. 3 months later, Henry Kissinger, at the invitation of the Chinese, made his secret trip to Beijing, early July of 1971, and in those secret talks laid the basis for President Nixon's formal presidential trip to China in February of 1972. And that really initiated this dynamic that did change the context and the political and strategic maneuvering of the Cold War period. Now let me just comment a little bit, since Dick Allen did make an observation about China today that is worth looking at. How did that initiative play out now with the perspective of more than 30 years? The Chinese, without question, have benefited by the relaxation of tensions and then the normalization of relations with the United States that was completed during the Carter administration, 1978, 79, and then by the transition in Chinese leadership away from the revolutionary Mao Zedong to Deng Xiaoping, who opened up China and set in motion the truly phenomenal economic growth of China and the rise of the most populous country in the world, which today, at the beginning of the second decade of the 21st century, is reshaping certainly the world economy, and we'll have to see what its impact is more broadly in strategic terms. One of the things that President Nixon was concerned about in his opening to the Chinese was not dispiriting our allies, and above all, Taiwan. Zhou Enlai, in his discussions with President Nixon and Henry Kissinger, thought that Chiang Kai-shek, who was still, Chiang died in 1975, but thought that Chiang on Taiwan would be so dispirited by the opening that they would throw in the towel, there would be an accommodation of some sort, and that China would be reunified on the basis that Mao and Zhou Enlai had perceived, that is, Taiwan coming under communist control. Today, 2011, Taiwan's still there. Taiwan has prospered, its politics have opened, its economy has taken off, and one of the great interesting challenges for the next decade or two is whether the Taiwan mainland China relationship, as it's now generally referred to, largely detoxified of its civil war element, can somehow lead to an accommodation in a situation where the United States still does what it can to secure the island. The other two fascinating elements that are resulting out of the Nixon initiative of 1971 are Vietnam and Korea. One of the tremendous ironies of those initiatives is today, who is one of our most enthusiastic friends in Asia? It's Vietnam, because of Vietnam's fear of this resurgent China. And where that relationship will go, given China's increasing pressure on its claims to the South China Sea, remains a very interesting question. And finally, there's Korea. Again, we think back to President Eisenhower concerned about ending the Korean War. One of the interesting stories about the Kissinger secret trip to Beijing in the summer of '71 is that, unknown to Kissinger, and we only discovered it later, was that at the same time that Kissinger secretly was in Beijing, Kim Il-sung, the North Korean communist leader, was also in Beijing. They didn't know it, and of course Zhou Enlai had kept them all apart. Shortly after the secret trip, within a few hours actually, Zhou Enlai went back to North Korea to try to reassure Kim Il-sung that the opening to the United States was not going to harm North Korean interests. And then he went down to Vietnam shortly thereafter to try to reassure the Vietnamese leaders that China would not compromise their security. But both these smaller communist countries were highly unnerved, as were, frankly, our allies in the region about how that would happen. Mm-hmm. Contrast the situation in Taiwan today with North Korea. North Korea has never been able to break out of the hammerlock of the Kim family dynasty. Its economy has never taken off. The elite in North Korea hangs on by its nuclear program and its artillery pointed at Seoul, while South Korea has become, again, one of the great economic and political success stories, and North Korea, a collapsed economy and a society that is seriously impoverished by what the Kim family has imposed on that society, now has to lean on China for its security and for its economic well-being. So the Nixon initiative set off some very dramatic trends that continue to play out and without question have enhanced American security.
Ambassador, thank you very much. Secretary Lehman?
Well, thank you. And in the interest of full disclosure, I have to disclose that I am a Dick Allen trained man. While his introduction was brief, there are many things left out that are relevant here. Dick was one of the three founders, along with Arleigh Burke, for whom this theater is named, of the what is now the CSIS. And while he was there, he wrote a book called Peace or Peaceful Coexistence, which I read when I was an undergraduate and was very much struck by. And so I made a pilgrimage to the CSS, as it was then called, part of Georgetown University, which was in a tiny little townhouse in Georgetown, and met Dick for the first time, and that led to a long relationship that endures strongly to the present day. But it was Dick Allen who brought me into the White House on his staff and on the Kissinger staff, and that has influenced my thinking ever since. And what I wanted to talk about is to set a geopolitical and a military context for what the world looked like when Richard Nixon took office, because it's really the balance was so much tilted against the United States that people tend to forget the environment in which he had to work. He really had a three-front war. He was the first president elected since the mid-19th century with both houses of Congress in the hands of the other party. And it was bitterly divided at the time over the Vietnam War. And not just the Vietnam War, but the actual Cold War itself, with books like Convergence and Two Apes on a Treadmill, and the rise of revisionist historians that really interpreted history as the Cold War being our fault, that the Soviet Union was just reacting to our constant building of the military and provocation. And that was also part and parcel of a defeatism that had grown in NATO, because at the time people were very skeptical of the idea of a Sino-Soviet rift. And from the Central Europe, the Western Europe perspective, they faced a massive Chinese potential military reinforcement of an already massive Warsaw Pact standing army of 180 divisions that were poised to sweep across Western Europe. And everyone knew in NATO councils that the argument was between whether it would take 1 week, 2 weeks, or 3 weeks for the Warsaw Pact to reach the Channel. Nobody argued. There wasn't a serious argument anywhere in NATO that was all that it would take for them to sweep across Europe. And then it would go nuclear. And the Western Europeans knew that, well, we could call it a tactical nuclear weapon for their exchange. That so-called flexible response was a trigger to all-out nuclear war for them. What is tactical from the other side of the Atlantic is very total for them when nuclear weapons are used. And then the third front was, of course, Vietnam and Southeast Asia. And so the president had a daunting strategic picture when he came in. It was very easy to criticize his initiatives to start negotiations on strategic arms limitation and ballistic missile defense and so forth. But the fact is there were no real strategic building programs going on in the United States at the time when President Nixon took office. The Russians had 5 new strategic systems being deployed. They had 2 new bombers, strategic bombers, including the backfire. They had the SS-18, the SS-11s. They had new solid-fueled rockets and nuclear intercontinental ballistic missiles. They were at the full deployment and touting of their 1,700 ship Navy. And while the United States fleet at the time that President Nixon came in was rapidly shrinking from just below 1,000 ships, it was declining at about 10% a year, while the Soviet fleet was growing at about 20% a year, and serious ships, more than 100 nuclear submarines, and we had no building programs. And so it's my belief that his allowing of the détente view of American policy to gain the traction it did, which led to the negotiations of the SALT I treaty and the ballistic missile, the ABM treaty, was because he, after he was out of office, had discussed with him myself, he didn't have many alternatives. It was, in his view, a way to keep things kind of say nice doggy, while he looked for a stick. And and the congressional front, it's very, we think we have a bitter, divided polity here in Washington today, especially in Congress. This is a Sunday school picnic compared to the bitterness of those years in Congress. And it wasn't strictly Republican-Democrat by any means. The Congress was very different then. It was, both parties were split between hawks and doves, to oversimplify. The Jackson wing of the Democratic Party was still very strong and more anti-détente than the Republicans were. And whereas the Republicans, there were many more liberal Republicans at the time, like Clifford Case and so forth, that split the Republicans. So it was a very complicated situation. And I think that with the perspective of history, it was a very astute way to deal with the issue, because in order to get the ABM treaty and the SALT I treaty through, it was necessary to use, and the president did it, I think, very effectively with his congressional relations staff and his own personal relationships on the Hill, to force the liberal Democrats and the liberal Republicans in the case wing of the party to support an entirely new, what was then called ULMS, an underwater launch ballistic missile system, which is now the Trident, a new B-1 bomber, the Tomahawk cruise missiles, a new MX missile, the beginning of the spending for that deployment. And so the criticism against, and it was a real criticism, against those two treaties as the fruits of détente, was that it legitimized a 2-to-1 advantage by the Soviet Union in strategic delivery systems. And it put a stop, an effective stop, to the expansion of the advantage that the United States had in the technology of ballistic missile defense. The Soviets did not have the capability to deploy ABM, and we did. We had 2 active sites at the time the treaty was negotiated. But in retrospect, this was what enabled the funding and the acceleration of these strategic programs, which heretofore had been totally blocked on the Hill. And so in retrospect, it was, I believe, in President Nixon's view, the way to use some jujitsu in a political hostile situation to begin the redressing of the balance that he felt had been allowed to decline very, very seriously. And with regard to the opening to China, as you know, there have been several books written about the Navy's role in gathering intelligence during those years. Suffice it to say that some of these books have alleged that we were tapping cables and reading in real time exactly what the Russians were, the Soviet High Command was reacting, thinking, and ordering in their deployments and so forth. And there's no doubt in my mind that the opening to China, which I thought was ably handled after the thunderclap of the trip, had a huge impact on Soviet thinking that suddenly transformed their perspective from clearly being arrogantly dominant in knowing that they could sweep to the Channel. One of the highest Soviet planners told me that they ran extensive war games, just as we did, every year, and even better analytically tooled ops analysis of all of the NATO exercises and all of our exercises. And they said they never had an exercise in which, nor did their intelligence gathering from NATO exercises, where they weren't able to get to the Channel in a week. And then suddenly, they had to suddenly face a two-front strategic dilemma, because here was the United States now dealing with China, and China was becoming much more aggressive in dealing with the Soviet Union, because they had this new opening which the Chinese saw even better than we, how much that would change the strategic picture in the Pacific. So I believe that the Cold War ended as it did in no small measure because of the impact, however astutely or badly it was played as the years went by, of this tremendous sea change in the strategic global balance with the openings to China.
John, you've really opened a very interesting line of inquiry here, because it wasn't, the opening to China was as much about the Soviet Union as it was about China. And President Nixon, in his later years, said to me that there were two major mistakes that he saw he had made. One was wage price controls, in which I would agree.
Yes, indeed. Yes,
I would agree that that was a big mistake.
I certainly would.
Wage price controls, politically.
And detaching the dollar from the gold standard.
We're all foreign policy guys, so you domestic guys can react later.
But the second was that he didn't mine Haiphong and do the more intense bombing of North Vietnam earlier in '69, rather than when he did it after the trip to China and before the trip to the Soviet Union. We forget that the trip to the Soviet Union was the first trip by an American president to the Soviet Union. And he did it against the backdrop of very strong military attacks on North Vietnam that he later regretted he'd done earlier. My question is, if he had done it earlier, would it have been possible to do it earlier with respect to his thinking about going to China? Would it have been possible to go to China against that? With respect to the Soviet Union, would he have been able to do it earlier without having some violent response from them? Well, after the trip to China, they were unnerved by that. And of course, just as an added piece of this, the very fact that the trip was pulled off after that was seen, you can imagine how the North Vietnamese felt about that.
Even, if I may just point out, even an earlier incident, which occurred within the first 70 or 80 days, John will remember, the North Koreans shot down unarmed EC-121, which was a Constellation, old propeller-driven aircraft, naval aircraft, observation plane. And
That's a nice term for a spy plane.
what? Yeah, I mean for a spy plane, yes, EC-121. And we got the hit order, to write the hit speech. So I said to John, see if you can't find Kennedy's 1961 Cuban Missile Crisis speech. I'm supposed to draft this speech for RN, and little did I know that he was having two speeches written. And so we labored for a couple of days. It had to be a very quick response time, and submitted the draft of a speech to RN, and then watched at the press conference or the announcement that night what happened, and RN announced that he wasn't hitting, wasn't striking. We had called for targets in North Korea, by the way, and there weren't any. Everything was under rocks, in mountainsides, harbors were built, there was nothing exposed except the civilian population. So a countervailing strike wouldn't have, countervalue would have been nothing. So there was no point in doing that. What was the ultimate reason? President Nixon thought that by not reacting militarily in that early provocation, whether we committed the provocation or they committed the provocation by shooting down the 121, sending a signal to the Chinese that we intended to pursue a reasonable course and would not resort immediately to force. The Sino-Soviet split, should also be remembered, came as a result of the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's where it really broke into the open. The Chinese condemned the Soviets for backing down, saying that they were not revolutionaries after all, that they had basically lost their revolutionary fervor, and it was China that was going to carry on with this vast revolutionary warfare, people's war, and so on and so forth, national liberation movement.
Let me just give you an alternative view of the origins of the Sino-Soviet, not to break your train. It really was Khrushchev's attack on Stalin at the 56th Party Congress.
1956, 20th Party Congress, yes.
Which told Mao Zedong that the man he had relied on for his own political credibility in China, Stalin, had been taken down. So Khrushchev, in effect, was undermining Mao's authority within the communist movement. Correct. Which is not to say that the Cuban Missile Crisis wasn't.
It was the scab that was more or less picked, so to speak, if I can put it.
Since we're in the Navy Memorial here with distinguished naval persons like our National Archivist here, let me take the naval view of your question. Could we have taken action earlier? My own view is that we could have mined the entire North Vietnamese coast without bringing China in. Had we embarked on the kind of Christmas bombing, B-52 saturation bombing, or taken a lot more of the protected sites off the protected target list, I think that would have brought Chinese reinforcement, not necessarily brought them into the war covertly. I don't think that would have happened, but they would have greatly increased their support because, and I really want to hear both Dick's response to this, but the hostility between the Vietnamese and the Chinese goes back millennia, and the Chinese were not that comfortable in supporting Vietnam. Certainly they supported them in solidarity with their communist brothers, but their national dislike of the Vietnamese made a much more complex issue. I personally think we could have brought a better and earlier end to the war had we mined, particularly enforced a mining operation, but not increasing the bombing.
What I find interesting, significant about this exchange is that the way President Nixon combined the use of military strength and diplomacy. And diplomacy, the military capability was always the servant of diplomacy. And I think he felt that and to relate it to the Vietnam situation, that he felt that his opening to the Chinese would so demoralize the Vietnamese, it again would change the dynamic of the Paris negotiations about ending the Vietnam War. And I think there he had to have been disappointed in the degree to which the Vietnamese toughed it out. And of course, you remember the relationship deteriorated to the point where Deng Xiaoping tried to, as the phrase went, teach the Vietnamese a lesson in and I'm trying to remember
1979 it was, when they had their war with Vietnam.
That when Deng Xiaoping came to Washington on his triumphal conclusion of the normalization process, he told President Carter he was going to teach the Vietnamese a lesson. They had a border punch-up. The Vietnamese did actually give the Chinese a bloody nose. They didn't come out very well out of it. But that level of hostility was there. It's been there, as you said, for centuries, and it's still there in the balance in the region today. But again, for President Nixon, the military was always a component, with the diplomatic, the political deal being the ultimate objective.
I'd just like to make one point that has not been made, although you mentioned the president's books. There is a corpus of 10 books that Richard Nixon has written. And it wasn't just 6 crises after having lost the governorship in California and writing about 6 major crises of his life. But had you displayed some of them on the way. I think I have all of them, and I think I have all of them signed by RN, a great treasure. If you take those 10 books together, and I have not reread them in recent years, but what I do remember of them is that you have a complete worldview, what the Germans would call a Weltanschauung, that is complete. Not ideological and closed in thought, but you also contest the evolution of Mr. Nixon's thinking in reaction to real events. He recognized the opening, as we discussed with the article in October 1967, Foreign Affairs, which was my job to explain within a few months. People didn't pay any attention to it. I'll tell another.
No, but there was, excuse me for interrupting, some people were paying attention. And the
literati like you were paying attention.
No, but the Chinese were. I mean, one of the things Ed Cox said, that Richard Nixon read history and thought about it deeply. When he had his first meeting with Zhou Enlai, what has Zhou Enlai said? I've read your 6 crises.
Yeah,
it's not a bad.
That's exactly right.
And he said it's not a bad book. And just to brag just slightly, when I joined the National Security Council staff, I had just finished a 600-page book analyzing Chinese politics. The Chinese went and translated that book, as they did, of course, Mr. Nixon's writings, and we're getting word back that...
Did you get your royalties?
Pardon?
Did you get your royalties?
Right, 1 billion and some readers. Unfortunately, no royalties. But the point is that the Chinese did really want to understand the thinking of their counterparts.
But there's another critical point that you're absolutely right, Dick, about that. Another critical point, the press, the American press, didn't want to understand Richard Nixon's positions. And I want to relate a very humorous incident that took place down in Key Biscayne in the summer of, in the fall of 1968. Martin Anderson and his wife Annalise, also a great scholar, and I were talking with Mr. Nixon, and I believe Alan Greenspan was there too. Bibi Rebozo, one of Mr. Nixon's greatest friends, was there. It was at Rebozo's home, and RN himself. And we were discussing the press treatment of RN's discussion of many issues. And he said, damn it, the press is not paying attention to what I'm saying on the issues. And I've spoken on every darned issue there is. And Martin and I said, yes, sir, we know. And I had been keeping issues for about 2 years of Richard Nixon's statements. And I'd had Pat Buchanan sending me the speeches, and I was cutting them up. And at that time, this was before computers and Xerox machines, I'd slice it out, and I put it in cards on a shoebox. Now, there's a story within the story. This was while I was at the Hoover Institution. So we had about 15 or 16 people on the staff, and we had some people who would assemble my equipment or my stuff. And one of the side tasks in doing this for the Yearbook on International Communist Affairs was to use one of the people to collect the Richard Nixon statements, and I would categorize them: Latin America, Asia, Europe, Soviet Union. So I had this continuing shoebox full of cards. And one day I came in and I gave it to a young lady, and I said, "You're doing this work now?" She said, "Yes, I am, sir." So, well, we got it all fixed up and done. And I walked out. I thought, where have I seen her before? Well, I went home that day, and on the cover of Time magazine, it was a story of a interracial marriage that had taken place among 2 Stanford students, one of them being Dean Rusk's daughter. Dean Rusk's daughter was organizing my Nixon issues cards. So I went back in the next day and said, excuse me, you're Margaret, you are who I think you are, aren't you? She said, "Yes, Mr. Allen, but I need this job. And my husband and I need the money that I'm making in this job, and I would never, ever say anything to my father." I went away almost in tears. I didn't say a word. Thought, well, fat's in the fire. I later got a chance to tell Secretary Rusk that story, and he was absolutely gobsmacked by what happened. Going fast forward, those cards, Mr. Nixon at that meeting said, "Allen and Anderson, you get your rear ends on an airplane right now and get up to New York, and I want within 4 days, with the aid of Bill Casey, who came as a volunteer to the campaign, we put together a 168-page book of Nixon on the issues, had them printed, I designed them, and I had one copy, leather-bound, entitled Nixon Socks It To Him." And it was carried up to the plane by Mary Froning of my staff in New York and given to Mr. Nixon, that one leather-bound copy. He said, "That's great, give it to the press." And Martin Anderson went through the back of the plane, handing it out to the press, and never again, for the rest of the campaign, did the question of Nixon on the issues ever come up.
And Dick, you raise a very good point about Mr. Nixon. And during the build-up to the '68 election, there was a period of time when he said to the staff, "You're not going to see me for the next 9 months. I'm going to be traveling. You go ahead and do what you have to do politically, but I'm going to South America, I'm going to the Mideast, I'm going to Asia." And he did that with one person accompanying him. And he built up a dossier.
Normally Pat Buchanan.
Right, on the issues. But this opens up other areas, of course. The Cold War wasn't just about China and Vietnam, but it was also about the Mideast and what was going on in the Mideast, and of course the '73 war in the Mideast. And he was prepared to deal with what came up in the Yom Kippur War. The threat to Israel, which he then took care of personally. I mean, he made sure the resupplies were on the way. And then he made sure that face was saved for the Egyptian army. And that led the way. Of course, the Soviets already left Egypt, but it opened the relationship between Egypt and the United States, the relationship between the military, which I think is even important at this day. But would someone like to comment on the Mideast part of the Cold War and what Mr. Nixon did then and the impact?
Just one quick vignette, and then I'll pass it on. But since we're in the Navy Memorial here, the way that President Nixon, it was hanging in the balance in '73, as you remember, and for the first time, the Russians had given the Egyptians and the Syrians handheld heat-seeking missiles. And they were devastating the Israeli Air Force. And they needed replacements. They needed A-4s and they needed Phantoms. Not one of our allies in NATO would allow landing rights. And fighters, of course, can't make it across the Atlantic and across the Mediterranean to get to. So within, as you know, Richard Nixon had spent time in World War II on carriers and was well aware of their capabilities. He said, why don't you line up some aircraft carriers and hopscotch them over? Within 2 days, the Navy had 4 carriers strategically placed, and the A-4s and the Phantoms hopscotched across the Atlantic and got to Israel before they lost their whole Air Force.
And because Golda Meir knew those were on the way, they could go on the offensive against the Egyptian armies.
Right.
But then there's the other half of it. When the Israelis in several weeks had trapped the Egyptian armies in the southern Sinai, at that point, President said, no, stop. And he had the ability to do it, of course. And that led to the relationship between Egypt and the United States. Is that correct?
Well, I think that's exactly right. And it was, again, a great strategic insight that propelled him to make the decisions that he made at the time. There was a lot of hesitation internally at that time. But he saw the shape of what could come out of it if the players on the chessboard were treated accordingly. It's even more remarkable that right now there's great reason to worry about the reversal of all of that in terms of an Egyptian-Israeli relationship and what will come as a result of the Middle East today. I do wish we had RN around so that we could get some thinking and guidance on how to handle the Middle East, because it's sorely needed.
Go back to those cards.
Yeah, go back to the cards.
I guess we're all a little bit in our anecdotage, so I can't resist telling.
Anecdotage, you said?
That's well put.
I can't resist telling the story of one of the first trips I took with Dick early in the administration. We went to Libya.
We were the last White House officials to visit Libya before the takeover by Gaddafi.
And I sat next to the defense minister. This was right before Gaddafi took over, and King Idris was off in Greece getting medical treatment. And he told the defense minister, said, well, we were very impressed with how your Navy pilots flew against the Egyptians. And I said, well, they weren't Navy pilots, they were Israelis. The Israelis have Phantoms. And he said, oh yes, but we've lived with the Jews for 1,000 years, they can't fly airplanes. This was a defense minister.
Well, was that when they served me lamb? And I
the lamb's eye, yes,
well,
right.
The point was, another thing that John did to me on that trip, by the way, was to arrange for me to fly in the back seat of an F-4 with a full ordnance strike on the desert training facility. He rode another airplane, and we maintain fond memories of that. But shortly thereafter, Gaddafi took over, and the big issue was, my God, they're going to raise the price of oil from $5 a barrel.
And that's an interesting observation, Dick. But you did refer to, with respect to the resupply, that the president himself said, how about lining up aircraft carriers to get them there? There was resistance in the Defense Department and in the State Department. They were trying to think what to do. But President Nixon, because of that issues box and because he had thought this out in advance, said, no, we're going to do this. How about doing it this way? Let's get it done. And the consequences of that stretched out for many years.
Well, what else would be new than resistance from the State Department to a White House initiative?
Let me just add, since we're coming out with all these inside baseball stories, something about his long enduring concern with maintaining an effective relationship with the Chinese. And that relates to his reaction to the Tiananmen shoot up of the students. And he privately made it very clear to President Bush 41 that the relationship with China could not be destroyed by the public reaction to the shooting of the student demonstrators, and that led to the secret trip that Brent Scowcroft took in the summer of '89 to try to sustain the relationship through was obviously a period where the domestic basis of political support for the Chinese had been seriously eroded, undermined by Tiananmen. The other part of it, which I was in the middle of, was in 1990 I was negotiating a settlement to the Cambodian conflict and the issue of trying to deal with our POW/MIA issue as it related to Vietnam. And we were having negotiations through the United Nations Security Council, first in New York and then in Paris. And this was after Tiananmen, and dealing with the Chinese on a direct bilateral basis was still a no-no, but we were dealing with them through the UN. And President Nixon knew I was carrying out this negotiation. I was the Assistant Secretary for East Asia at that point. And he invited me to dinner at his house in Saddle River, New Jersey. And he grilled me on what our objectives were in negotiating with the Chinese, what were we going to do with Vietnam, because he was very worried that we were going to somehow go too easy on the Vietnamese and somehow compromise our dealings with the Chinese. And for whatever it's worth, I think the dinner discussion reassured him. And now if you look at the outcome of the Cambodia settlement and the roadmap to normalizing with Vietnam, if there was any beneficiary of that negotiation, which did get all of the major powers who had been involved in Indochina since the French colonial period, it was the Chinese, because with the French out, the British out, the Americans out, China's just over the border.
That's interesting. One of the jobs of a national security advisor in the staff, council staff, is to brief former presidents from time to time.
Right.
And I once went up to New York in 1981 and brought a leading Soviet specialist and Richard Pipes and China specialist Jim Lilly. And on the way in, Mr. Nixon said to me, called in the car, and we had big clunky phones, and he said, "Are those people with you?" And I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "Tell them to go shopping for a while before we have dinner, and I want to talk to you." So I sat down with him alone. He said, "All right now, Alan, I want you to tell me what's going on inside. I want to know what's going on, all of the details there." Well, I had to sort of bunt my way through that afternoon, because his long arm and his mind were still very much in the present of that day. He knew exactly what was going on. He kept the tetrodes, if you will, into various parts of the government. He could talk to a Dick Solomon, he could talk to me, he could talk to an Al Haig, he could talk to anybody he wanted to, because people would answer his telephone calls and answer his summons. And that night we had a dinner in that brownstone in New York City, and he displayed all of the mastery that really he had for a long time and never lost until the very end.
Let me add one other story. I mean, you've gotten my juices flowing about how important China was to this man. After I served on the National Security Council staff to the summer of '76, then I went to the Rand Corporation for what turned out to be a decade. Anyway, early 1977, I'm sitting in my office, and my secretary, eyes wide open, says, "President Nixon's on the line." Now, when I worked for Henry Kissinger, the president never called directly to staff levels like us. But President Nixon had just recovered from his phlebitis, and of course was in that dark situation after his resignation. And he grilled me for over a half hour. What's going on in China? I don't think he wanted to call Henry Kissinger to find that out. He knew what I was up to and about. And he hung up at the end of this half hour, and I said, that son of a gun, he is going to rehabilitate himself by going to China. And sure enough, a few months later, it was announced that the Chinese had invited him as their old friend to come back to China, and it really began, if you like, the political rehabilitation as an international figure of Richard Nixon.
That's an extremely important point. I went out to see him in San Clemente afterwards, and we walked the beach a little bit, and he talked of a program, a get well program. He didn't use those words, but a get well program. It was shortly after he had gone out to California, and he had a plan even then, a strategic plan that he was going to implement, and he was going to travel. And it was an amazing thing to watch, a plan that he set out once more, again. He's had plans all his life, strategic plans that unfolded. And the Get Well plan was extremely well thought through and executed, masterfully executed. 10 books. A comprehensive, in fact, my thought is that coming up on RN's centennial for 2013, it might be a very good idea to put together the 10 in a set so that they're in not just disparate volumes, but that they're republished and put together in a boxed set.
Well, there are extraordinary books that still reverberate through the day. He was one of the first to write about the Muslim countries stretching from Morocco to Indonesia, yes, and their importance for the future. This was long before other people had focused on it. You can see it grow from book to book to book as he wrote about it. I remember on August 9 of 1974, as we rose in Marine One and went by the Washington Monument, what do you say? He was still president until noon, to the president. And I said, Mr. President, 10 years, you'll be back. Sure enough, 10 years later, on the cover of Newsweek magazine by order of Katharine Graham, after she heard him make a presentation, an extraordinary ability of his to present what was going on in the world and in politics, and on the cover of Newsweek, he's back.
Ed, I have snuck up behind you, and that's a perfect note to conclude this forum on. We could go on all afternoon, and we expect more forums, more talks about the 37th president with people, these people and others, but you see what we get into. Thank you for watching. Thank you for coming. We have another forum on June 13th. Thank you.
Thank you. Well done.
That was fun.
I really enjoyed it. It really was a lot of fun. It's when they get the juices flowing.